Caroline mentioned, I'll be giving my talk in English, just mainly because I'm a lot more comfortable with technical terms in English. My talk's about 30 minutes, and what I'll be talking about today is a part of my research that revolves around how to both identify and then meaningfully engage stakeholders and communities, for example, traditionally marginalized communities, in water resources planning and management discussions. And I'll focus in on one particular tool. Of course, there's many tools to do this and approaches, but I'll be looking or talking about one tool that we found to be quite useful, which is causal loop diagrams. So what I'll talk about in my brief talk today is I'll first just begin talking about why would we want to engage stakeholders. Takes more time, can sometimes be more costly, problematic. So why would we want to engage stakeholders in discussions related to water resources planning and management? I'll then go over a brief overview of what causal loop diagrams are and how they're a foundational tool in systems dynamics modeling. I'll then go through a brief example of a causal loop diagram, and it's a very simple example, but hopefully you'll be able to see how it can facilitate productive stakeholder discussions. And I'll give the example I'll be going through is a community that needs to decrease its water demand. And then finally, I'll end today's lecture very briefly introducing a research project I'm involved in, which entails the development of a participatory model building framework, which builds off of what I'll be talking about for the first 25 minutes or so. So why would we want to engage stakeholders? I think there's three main reasons. It improves decision-making, or it can help improve decision-making. It can help the implementation of plans and strategies. And more generally, there are the ethical considerations. In terms of decision-making, involving stakeholders, local communities, traditionally marginalized communities, for example, Indigenous communities in Canada and elsewhere, can really provide a very useful source of local data, local knowledge, and local opinions. For example, if a certain project, for example, some sort of water-related infrastructure, if it's something that's socially accepted in that particular community or not, it's better to find out early on rather than later on in the process. And so by involving stakeholders, we can often improve both the quantity and quality of the knowledge and the data that we have, which of course, better data, more data, better data, and local knowledge, data, and opinions can help develop better plans. Involving stakeholders can also facilitate the implementation of plans. So once, let's say, a certain set of strategies and plans are accepted by that particular group of stakeholders, and we've created a shared understanding of the problems, the goals, the strategies that we're tackling, this increased sense of stakeholder ownership. If stakeholders have been involved in this process, typically they'll have a sense of stakeholder ownership, and that'll, of course, well, not of course, but often result in better support and involvement of stakeholders in the implementation of the plans and strategies. And of course, for example, they can also help, stakeholders can help monitor the implementation of those particular strategies. And the third main reason I think it's important to include stakeholders in water resources planning and management discussions is, at least for me, is probably the most important reason, is the ethical consideration. In other words, that local stakeholders, local communities should be able to influence the basic social circumstances of their lives. In other words, stakeholders in communities, and for example, traditionally marginalized stakeholders in communities should be allowed to, should have the possibility of voicing their own needs and their own definitions of well-being, rather than having someone else do this for them, which is typically what often has happened in the past. So for me, really, the ethical consideration is really quite important. In other words, whether whatever plan or strategy or set of plans and strategies that are going to be implemented, are they socially acceptable to that particular local community? And this is particularly important with respect to traditionally marginalized communities. And I'll briefly give an example later on with a water and food security project that we're involved in Guatemala. So who should be included in a participatory process? There's two main steps. Internally, within, for example, the research team, if it's a research project, or within a watershed organization or whatever entity or engineering organization that's been tasked with developing a set of plans and strategies, we would first brainstorm and assess a set of key stakeholders that should be involved. And then you can use various frameworks. There are many frameworks to identify key stakeholders. One that we've used in my research group quite a bit was developed by Elias et al. In 2002, but more recently, one of my PhD students, Azadi Nambaig, also developed a four-step process, and that's the reference Inam et al. 2015. So there are various approaches that can be used to identify those key stakeholders. Once you've identified them, at the first series of stakeholder meetings, you would ask those invited stakeholders, have we missed anyone that's important, and then invite those stakeholders. An example would be some of the research I did in the past in Cyprus. After our initial brainstorming session and using the framework of Elias to identify key stakeholders, at the initial stakeholder meeting, quite a few of the stakeholders that have been invited mention that we really need to invite representatives of the hotel industry in Cyprus because they're large users of water. And we had not done so, so we then invited them. The final composition of your stakeholder group should have representatives of all roles. So the decision makers, the users, the implementers, and the experts, plus stakeholders who are related to at least one of the attributes of power, legitimacy, urgency, and interest, plus, and for me this is particularly important, is ensuring traditionally underrepresented stakeholders or communities, for example, indigenous communities, are included. So moving on to causal loop diagrams, which is a tool in the broad area of systems dynamics modeling. As some of you or many of you probably know, systems dynamics is an approach that's been around for close to 70 years. It was developed by Jay Fourstep at MIT. And there's many approaches that can be used to explore complex systems. Systems dynamics, what's different about it or unique about it is that it uses what are called feedback loops, and I'll talk briefly about this later. And feedback loops can help us describe and understand how even simple systems can be complex and nonlinear. And I'll show an example later on of this. So causal loop diagrams are a qualitative tool in systems dynamics, and they help visualize how different variables in a particular system, for example, a watershed, are interrelated. And each variable, and I'll show an example in a second, each variable is connected by an arrow to one or more variables upon which it has an influence. And the arrows, and I'll show this in a second, show the direction of causality. Another way to think of a causal loop diagram, which is effectively a qualitative systems dynamics model, is a mental map that represents what a particular stakeholder or group of stakeholders thinks about a particular problem. For example, water scarcity or agricultural water pollution in the Duchenne watershed in Quebec, for example. So what that particular stakeholder or group of stakeholders thinks are the important elements in a system, the relationships to another. So what's the problem, according to them? What are the causes of the problem, the consequences of the problem, feedbacks, and strategies that can be used to address that particular problem? And this allows us to sort of understand beliefs about the system, how the system works. In other words, how either one or more stakeholders believes this particular system works, and of course, what their preliminary ideas are in terms of strategies to address that particular problem. So here's an example of a simple causal loop diagram. In the middle, we have a problem variable. So if you can imagine, this is for water scarcity in Cyprus. We would first use a framework to identify our key stakeholders. And let's say we identify 10 key stakeholders. We would take a white piece of paper, have a bunch of sticky notes and a pencil. You would have a facilitator, for example, a researcher or a watershed management watershed management director, who would facilitate this process. And you spend about 3-4 hours developing this particular model, either with each stakeholder or as a group of stakeholders. We would first identify the problem variable, which is here in the middle, water scarcity. On the left-hand side, we have first-order causes, second-order causes, and so on. We'd spend maybe an hour working on those. On the right-hand side, we have first-order consequences, second-order consequences, third-order consequences, and so on. We'd spend about an hour on that. And then you can see these sort of loops going from the consequences back through the causes and back to the problem variable. Those are feedback loops. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But this is a basic causal loop diagram. And really, I view causal loop diagrams as a useful tool to facilitate more productive discussions about water resources problems. Of course, we can also use them for many other applications as well. So the causal loop diagrams, it's important to note that they help capture qualitative understanding. You can quantify them and develop a stock and flow simulation model. But what we're talking about really today is more as a tool to facilitate discussion. It's a qualitative understanding of a particular problem. We found that CLDs are easily understood by stakeholders. We've applied this approach in very diverse contexts in Guatemala, Pakistan, Germany, Hungary, here in Quebec, and almost in most cases with people that have no modeling background at all. And one thing that's interesting to note is that we've found that the modeling process itself, in other words, the development of these causal loop diagrams, rather than the models that are actually created, often offer the greatest value. So that process of spending time with a group of stakeholders so that they develop a shared understanding of the problem, they can also, develop a rapport with each other and have a better understanding of why, let's say, a certain group of stakeholders has a particular opinion. That process itself is really quite valuable. And it also helps us reflect upon the particular mental models of different stakeholders, what it is that we know and don't know, and of course, different perspectives. It also allows us, and in most cases, this process, we do it over many weeks, months, and even years. We would do one session, then do another session in a month, maybe another one in a couple of months. It allows for capacity building of stakeholders vis-a-vis their particular, for example, their watershed. So how do we build a participatory causal loop diagram? The approach that we use has 5 steps. We have our problem definition, for example, water scarcity in Cyprus, or in a particular watershed. We conduct our stakeholder analysis, and then we develop individual causal loop diagrams. Now, step 1, 2, and 3 are iterative, so we would be iteratively looking at those steps. Once we've developed our individual models, the facilitator, at least in what we typically do, would develop an overall model that encompasses all of the main elements of the individual causal loop diagrams, and then we'd have a group model building workshop. Now, of course, we can also sometimes just right away have a group workshop. But going back to what I said earlier, what we found, particularly with working with traditionally marginalized stakeholders, is it's better to first develop individual models with various community members, for example, indigenous farmers in Guatemala, because they're typically, when it's just them alone, more comfortable expressing their opinions. What we found in the past is if we had a large group of people, let's say an indigenous farmer in a rural area in Guatemala, along with government officials and modelers and experts, sometimes certain individuals would feel uncomfortable expressing their opinions, for example, because something that they thought that the government had implemented was actually not very useful, but they would tend to, we noticed after a while that they would be hesitant to express those opinions. So what we found in not all cases, of course, but in a lot of cases, it's better to do the individual causal loop diagrams first, and then have a group model building session where everyone is there together and we can look at the model. There's a 4-step process we follow, proposed by Venix in 1996. Step 1, you identify the problem variable, you add causes on the left-hand side, consequences on the right-hand side, and then identify your feedback loops. And it's important to identify key stakeholders. There's many different approaches. As I mentioned earlier, the approach we've used often is one by Elias et al., where you list the stakeholders, even marginal ones, via brainstorming. you categorize the stakeholders based on their roles, you prioritize them based on their attributes, and then you select them based on their power and interest. And the idea here is to ensure diverse representation. You want local stakeholders, for example, farmers, different levels of government, different sectors, agriculture, industry, commerce. You also want to include experts, quote unquote, experts in water and agriculture and social issues, but also experts in, for example, modeling, NGOs, and of course, as I've already mentioned, traditionally underrepresented communities, for example, Indigenous communities in Canada. So as an example, this research that I'm talking about, we've done in many different contexts, but one of the larger projects we've been working on for the last 7-8 years is in Guatemala with small-scale subsistence farming with Indigenous farmers. And what we've done in that project is that the graduate students working on that project need to learn the local languages and conduct the entire causal loop diagram exercise in that particular language. So in Guatemala, yes, that might include Spanish, but actually we've focused much more on 3 Mayan indigenous languages, Caquichel, Tzutujil, and Quiche, so that we can really more meaningfully engage with those communities. And of course, this is on the side of our graduate students, they have to learn an additional language, but we found that to be particularly useful for many reasons. So here are some examples or pictures from an example of the development of a causal loop diagram for the water and food security project that I mentioned in Guatemala. And these are the types of questions we might ask when we want our stakeholders to develop a CLD, because it's important to remember that the facilitator doesn't develop the causal loop diagram. You're there to facilitate, for example, a farmer or whoever the stakeholder is, to develop their mental map, what they think the problem is, what they think the causes, consequences, and feedback loops are. So we might ask questions to help them, how has the problem developed over time? What is the problem and how is it developed over time? What are the first order, second order, third order causes of the problem? What are the consequences of the problem? What are the main feedback processes, or in other words, feedback loops? And what kind of policies, both short-term and long-term, do they think should be explored to address this particular problem? And what are some challenges? And this sort of, this set of questions is not definitive, but it sort of helps, and of course we would modify it depending on the context. It facilitates the development of a causal loop diagram. So here's some pictures of just one of many rural areas where we've developed these causal loop diagrams. This is in a market in a rural area in Guatemala with mainly indigenous farmers. This is a master's student from Guatemala, and you can see she has a big white piece of paper and she has a little yellow sticky note that's the problem variable, and on the left-hand side she has one cause variable. Here's the group of stakeholders that were involved, none of which had any, most of which had no modeling background. We did have some participants that were researchers that had some modeling background. And here is the final causal loop diagram that was developed. In the center, you can see here, there is a yellow sticky note, that's the problem variable. On the left-hand side, the pink sticky notes, there's first order causes, second order causes, third order causes. On the right-hand side, there's first order consequences, second order consequences, third order consequences. These long lines looping all over, those are feedback loops. And the white and green sticky notes are potential strategies or policies that could be used to address that particular problem variable, which is food insecurity. The idea again behind this is not quantified. It's to facilitate a more productive discussion. So rather than, for example, having groups of stakeholders argue, if we do A, I'm sure B will happen, they develop a simple qualitative causal loop diagram together, and they can have a bit more meaningful discussion, because they can actually, using the model that they developed together, trace out, okay, if we implement policy 1, let's see what happens, what effect it has on that particular problem variable. Of course, one can quantify this later on, and we've done so. But even at this stage, as a qualitative model, it's quite useful, again, to facilitate discussions. This is an example. This is just digitizing this particular causal loop diagram. So I'll go through a very simple example. I'm just checking the time here. I should be good. I'll go through a very simple example of how to develop a causal loop diagram. So imagine we're in a small town or village where there is a high level of water consumption, and we want to figure out ways to decrease it. So we use our some sort of framework, Enam, Elias, etc., to identify our key stakeholders. Let's say there's 10. And then we will go through the process. We identify the problem variable, add causes, add consequences, and look at feedback loops. And very quickly, feedback loops, essentially loops in the system are feedbacks, and qualitatively, this would indicate that a given change sets off a set of changes that cascades through to either reinforce or balance the original change. And if it reinforces it, it's called a reinforcement loop. And if it balances, it's called a balancing loop. So we'll go through the model together. Again, this is a very simplified model, but I just want to show you how, or hopefully show you how it can be used as a useful tool for discussions and to explore unexpected outcomes due to complexity and even, ostensibly a simple system. So we would ask, we'd have our white piece of paper and our sticky notes. We'd ask the stakeholders, what's the problem variable? They said it's high water consumption. So we have a problem variable here in pink, water consumption. We then ask them, what are some causes of water consumption, high water consumption? They might say wastage. Again, there might be many causes. We'll just pretend there's one. And then we'd say, well, what's a cause of wastage? And again, there might be many more. We'll just pretend there's two: environmental awareness and water prices. Again, for the purposes of this example, it's just a really simple model. And as we go put down our variables, we would draw little links going from the cause to the problem variable here. So far we have our problem variable in pink and one first order cause and two first order causes of that particular problem variable. We then ask them, well, what is a consequence of high water consumption? And let's pretend there's many obviously, but let's just pretend there's one, and that's the earnings for the water utility might be affected. And here we would draw a link between the problem variable to the consequence, but we would also see that there's probably a link between the earnings for the water utility, in other words, a consequence, and a cause, the water prices. So we draw a little arrow here. And that's an example here from water consumption to earnings for water utility to water prices back to wastage, back to water consumption of a feedback loop. I know this is a very simplified example, but I want to show you how even a simple model can be useful. We would then put little pluses and minuses. The way to think of it, if it's a proportional relationship, you put a plus. If it's an inversely proportional relationship, put a negative. Don't think of it more as increasing or decreasing. So let's say if environmental awareness increases, the wastage will likely decrease. Inversely proportional, put a little minus. The wastage increases, likely water consumption will increase. Proportional relationship, put a little plus, and then go through the model and do the same. What we would then do, we have a very simple model now. We have one problem variable, three causes, and one consequence. We would say to the stakeholders, what do you think, what are some possible strategies that can be used to address this particular problem? And let's say one that often comes up is to increase educational or environmental awareness. So let's see what happens. And again, what I'm going to show now is hopefully you can see how even a simple model like this that's qualitative can be used to facilitate more productive discussions. Because normally, let's say if someone says increase education, one would think that sounds great. I would agree with that. There really probably shouldn't be any negative or unexpected outcomes of this. But let's see. So we would say tell the stakeholders, okay, well, let's see what our model would tell us. So we increase education. So environmental awareness increases. The wastage could likely go down. The water consumption could go down. But then the earnings for the water utility might go down. Again, there's some assumptions here, but that's not so important. And over time, perhaps, the water prices could go up. It's not important here, the assumptions. What I'm just trying to show is, with this example, is how you might have some unexpected outcomes because of the complexity and feedbacks within a particular system. So if you can imagine, people are become more environmentally aware, use less water, but over time, let's just pretend in this example, the water utility needs to increase water prices. to compensate. So that's probably not an expected outcome. Using less water and prices of water go up. I know this is a simplified example and there's assumptions, that's not so important. I just want to show how this type of tool can be used to explore unexpected outcomes. And so rather than having one group of stakeholders arguing, I think if we increase education, it's perfectly fine, there are no potential problems, there might be some potential problems. So some points related to this. What we found to be quite useful is that if there's a group of stakeholders don't agree on a particular component of the model, we would put a little exclamation point, and then we would ask those groups of stakeholders or two stakeholders that don't agree to go research it together and report back to the group in a couple of weeks. And again, what I'm trying to sort of get at with this tool is we use it as a tool to facilitate discussions, to provide time for stakeholders to develop a shared understanding of the problem and also to develop a rapport with each other. Another thing, if stakeholders are unsure about a certain part, we would ask perhaps an expert in that particular group of stakeholders, well, could you go research it, present it back to the group. So again, it also provides for capacity building in that particular group. For example, in some of the work we've done in Guatemala, we had these sort of smaller sessions on, okay, what would be some potential impacts of climate change in that particular area in Guatemala. And like I said, we often develop the individual models first, then a group model. But of course, you can also do group models first, depending on the context. Last two slides, because I'm keeping an eye on the time and I know it's almost 30 minutes. So I've been involved with colleagues and students in a whole series of research projects that build off of this idea of causal loop diagrams, qualitative systems models. And it's sort of been centered around this idea of a participatory model building framework. And what we found many years ago is that a lot of organizations, a lot of stakeholders were hesitant about using participatory approaches because they thought it might cost more, might take more time, involve expertise that they don't have. So we wanted to come up with some sort of a gradual, stepwise approach that would facilitate stakeholders and organizations in at least exploring the possibility of using participatory approaches, for example, causal loop diagrams. And the first three steps, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, is exactly what we just talked about, basically developing an individual causal loop diagram. So we have our problem frame, we do our stakeholder analysis, and we develop our individual causal loop diagram. That's an iterative process. And then, you know, at this point, it might have taken a couple of hours. We have, you know, the costs are very low. It's some sticky notes and a white piece of paper. The technical skills are minimal. And if the group of stakeholders or the organization deems this to be useful, then we can continue this process, develop an overall group model. We could quantify that model, for example. We could maybe even dynamically couple that participatory built model with a physically based model, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is to gradually introduce this participatory approach. So to conclude, causal loop diagrams are one tool out of many. There are many other tools, of course, to engage stakeholders and to facilitate discussions. And it's important to note that the use of causal loop diagrams, it's a type of qualitative analysis. You cannot use it to infer quantitative behavior. However, these causal loop diagrams, even though they're very simple, can still be useful to help, as I already mentioned, explore the mental maps of different stakeholders. So what a particular stakeholder, a group of stakeholder thinks a particular problem is, what the causes of the problem are, the consequences, feedbacks, and solutions. It allows us also to combine local knowledge, especially from traditionally underrepresented communities, with expert knowledge, because sometimes as part of these, for example, the work in Guatemala that I mentioned, we also have expert modelers involved, government officials, university researchers, and so on. It can help us detect critical issues in a particular system, knowledge gaps, and it can also allow us to find potential areas of conflict. So that's something we see in this process before anything significant is done. for example, in a large-scale engineering infrastructure project, we can begin to tease out what some of the potential conflict areas might be that we might want to address before moving forward with any large-scale project. And more generally too, it allows us to increase our shared understanding with a group of stakeholders of complex social ecological systems. I tried to keep it to 30 minutes. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know I went a little bit quickly because I was cognizant of the 30-minute time frame.
So thanks a lot, Jan. Your time, it was perfect. This was a very interesting presentation. Note everyone that you will find Professor Adamowski's presentation on the CentrEau website later on. We now begin the question session. So if anyone has questions, you may write them in the chat box or notify us if you wish to ask the question aloud. Jan, I invite you to please read the questions in the chat box first before answering them, so that those watching the video, later on,
just going to,
be able to...
Hold on, I'm going to stop share, and then I can see, okay, here. Okay, let me just go up here.
So, do you see where is the chat box? It just
yes.
At the left of share screen, yes. So there's a few questions here. Okay.
I see a question. Is it a similar tool to Climate Fresco? I think it's Maeva that asked the question. I'm not really sure. I'm not familiar with Climate Fresco. So maybe if you could very briefly describe it.
Yes, hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. So yes, I participate to a kind of similar, I think, tool. It's a Climate Fresco. It's organized by the French OBNL. And it's like you have like at the beginning, like a card, a bunch of cards, in fact, and you have to connect this card to understand what the cause and effect and find the cause and effect. I think it's go less further than you into the workshop, but it looks like kind of similar. I put the link of YouTube if you want to have an idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think sometimes I think it's referred to card sort mapping, but I have heard of that. It's as you mentioned, it's a very similar similar approach. Thanks. Okay, I will scroll down here. I would like to get a copy. Yep. So someone asked if they can get a copy of the presentation. Yeah, of course I can. Either send me an email and I'll be happy to send it. But I believe the organizers are going to make that available. Okay, next question.
Yes, I just want to say here that the presentation of Prof. Adamowski will be on the CentrEau website on the page of the event. So it will be here later on. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question here from Zainab. Have you succeeded to choose an effective strategy to tackle the problem of water scarcity in Guatemala? And what could the first step to start educating the target population and convincing stakeholders? So I should mention the project is still, it's very much ongoing, but and it's a project, I should emphasize, it's water and food security. So we're looking at both of those topics, which are intertwined. And yes, we've had some initial results that I think are pretty interesting. One of the things we did is we compared using, in this not causal loop diagram, we used causal loop diagrams, but we then developed quantified systems dynamics models. But we found that to make a long story short, it was for indigenous communities probably better to not produce agriculture that would then be sold to larger organizations. So that was one topic we looked at pretty carefully. The sort of, to use the term loosely, subsistence farming uses a little bit less water. It also has, you have the ability to also have products for yourself. So that's something we did find was quite useful. And then in terms of steps to start educating the target population and convincing stakeholders, I would say, I think the way we view it is less of us educating and convincing stakeholders, rather us learning as much as we can from the stakeholders that we're working with in the communities, and then seeing what might be useful. To give another example in a different context, with some work we did with soil salinity in Pakistan, what we found is that the government officials had, for many years, been strong proponents of canal lining in a particular area. And what we found is that a lot of the stakeholders are saying it's not really working, but we're not comfortable saying that it's not working, I think because they were getting subsidies. But what we were able to do is through the modeling, which stemmed from causal loop diagrams, but then progressed to more quantitative models, is that indeed that canal lining in this particular context and the way it was being implemented was not particularly effective. And that's something that as an, one example out of many, that resulted in a change of, let's say, policies or strategies. Another question, have you tried it with industrial companies and how they received the workshop? Did they launch some sort of plans? So this is an interesting question. Most of the theory on causal loop diagrams, systems dynamics modeling stems from business and finance. And so I would say actually in the field of finance, not so much finance, but business more generally, the use of causal loop diagrams and systems modeling is very, is quite widespread. And I would actually say that we in, let's say, hydrology and in agriculture are using the tools that were developed, by Sturman and Forrester and so on, who typically develop these tools for looking at organizations. So yes, this is definitely, I myself, we haven't really used it with companies. We did do a small project quite a few years ago with a yogurt company in Ontario, where we looked at the possibility of reusing water that was used in the organization. But to sort of answer your question directly, the approaches I've mentioned today, and more generally systems dynamics modeling, are very, very widespread in the business community. Another question from Giancarlo. Hi, Giancarlo. I know him. He's one. He used to study at McGill with me. Nice to see you. Can stakeholder? I'm just going to read the question by myself quickly. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but if I understand correctly, he's asking, Giancarlo is asking whether, Giancarlo, you want to ask your question?
Yes, sorry, maybe, it came out a little bit, maybe complicated. Hello to everyone, and Professor, it's nice to see you again. In a reality of a watershed that is changing over time, sometimes with drastic change, for example, if some of the elements like the management of the wastewater is improved and so on, is there a way to use a systematic approach like the one that actually is captured by a CLD to continuously follow the evolution of the watershed, so that bringing stakeholders like manager and people that they operate or live in the watershed in a sort of like very active contribution to follow up a monitor and develop new hypotheses and new measure in a sort of like more time-based manner, rather than opposed to the consultation that it takes part in the beginning, at the phase, and normally at the cycle of each sort of like water management setup.
Good question. This is something I didn't mention, so I'm glad you raised this point. One of the reasons, for example, in Guatemala or the project in Pakistan, and in Cyprus too, we've been working on these projects for very long periods of time, 7-8 years, is that these CLDs and eventually the quantified models, if we go in that route, we're continuously updating them, refining them, changing them. So, for example, in let's say the study in Cyprus, we would be the CLDs And the whole modeling, participatory modeling process is something that we use as a tool to engage with stakeholders in discussion. So they would actually be, these models, CLDs, but also the quantified models, would be updated regularly with our group of stakeholders who've been part of it. You know, not all of them have been part of it since the beginning, but quite a few of them have. So that's something, that's a good question that yes, definitely, it's not that we developed, you know, for example, a causal loop diagram 5 years ago, and that's really the one that we've been using ever since. It's continuously being refined, updated, and particularly if we quantify it, we're quite, I would say, continuously modifying subroutines and so on. That's a good question. So it's I didn't really talk about it, but what we're trying to do too is we're trying to use the term loosely, institutionalize this process so that the ideal is that near the end of our involvement, we don't really need to be involved anymore. That's really the ideal. And that's challenging for a variety of different reasons. For example, we're trying to develop very simple user-friendly software. So Julien Mallard, who gave a talk at CentrEau recently, that's really actually been the focus of his PhD, is the development of user-friendly software tools to facilitate stakeholders who don't really have a modeling background to be able to use these approaches. There's quite a lot of questions here. Let me just look here. Okay, there's a question, I think, from Ariane asking, is it possible that important stakeholders may be forgotten? I assume by the question you're asking if we might have, let's say, inadvertently neglected a certain group of stakeholders that's important. I mean, that's always possible. We try, particularly with these projects that I'm involved in, they're, you know, multi-year. Over time, you know, we have stakeholders joining and leaving the process. But I would say that you know, if we followed the identification process carefully, we've done and we also quite regularly ask the stakeholders we're working with, you know, are we missing anyone? Should be including Group X or Group A? That typically most stakeholders that quote unquote should be involved are involved. Now, sometimes it can happen, you know, due to stakeholder burnout and other factors that someone or a group of stakeholders might not want to be involved. So that sometimes can be a challenge. But generally, I think if you're careful about it and you are conscious of the importance of making sure that, especially traditionally underrepresented stakeholders, but also, you know, key decision makers are involved, because if they're not involved, that could cause, you know, surprises later on when you come up with some great solutions, but the decision makers don't want to say it's, I don't know, it's too expensive, for example. Okay, there's a question from Alexandre. Without the proposed method, what would be the regular method to address the issues such as water scarcity in Guatemala? With your method, I understand that it offers the local communities a means to participate in the discussion. However, without this method, what would be the usual process? Well, okay, that's an interesting question. So, as I mentioned, this is just one tool out of many that can be used. And there are numerous tools and approaches that can be used to involve stakeholders. I would say, well, what we found, if we just focus on the project in Guatemala, is that in the past, it was the stakeholder engagement that was done, not by us, but by others, would typically be more of sort of an interviewing type process. But what we also found is due to language barriers and other barriers, that typically in the areas that we've been doing our work in Guatemala, the indigenous communities were pretty much marginally involved. One reason was that typically let's say the researchers would conduct the process in Spanish, and quite a lot of the indigenous participants would have to have a translator, and it gets more complicated. And it also they're not really directly participating. So that's why something that we've done, which of course is challenging, but I think is important, is that we've made it a condition for any graduate student working on this particular project, any project member really that's in the field, so to speak, has to learn the local languages beyond just Spanish. So, for example, Caquiche in quite a few of the areas that we've been doing work in. Yeah, so Maxine shared Julien's presentation, so thanks for that. If those of you so one of the main, I have about 4 or 5 students working on this topic, but one of the main students working on this particular topic is Julien, who's actually defending his PhD in 3-4 days. But so he has quite a few papers on this topic, and I would say, I didn't touch any of that today, but he goes into a lot more involved, let's say, models, quantifying the models, dynamically coupling them with physically based models, looking at different approaches to assess confidence in the models. So the last question I have here is, have you tried your method, for example, between industries and municipalities? No, we haven't. So the way we've implemented the group causal loop diagrams, we would have, in some of them, not so much in Guatemala, but let's say in the project in Pakistan, we would have some sub-elements of the overall model that would, have an agricultural sub-model, but also variables that are linked to, let's say, industry that might be in a particular that particular watershed and municipality. So yes, I guess indirectly we've incorporated the links through variables between industries and municipalities, but we haven't actually developed ourselves a model focusing purely on, let's say, an industry within a particular municipality.
And okay. There is there is a last question from Maiva as well. I don't know if you can see it. It's in the same.
Okay. Yes, I'm reading now. Yeah. Sorry. From your point of view, what should be the next step after a workshop like that? How would you keep alive those discussions? So if I understand correctly, the question is, let's say we've developed, I'm making this up here. Let's say we've developed 10 individual causal loop diagrams. Let's say 9 out of 10 say this is useful. I'd like to continue with this endeavor. We would then develop an overall, the facilitator, let's say Julien Mallard in this case, for example, would develop an overall group model. We would then have a group session where those 9 stakeholders that or community members or participants who wanted to be involved would be involved. And we would then assess the model. And there's a whole, I skipped all that, but there's a whole process there of ensuring that all important elements of the model are there. And then, as I mentioned earlier in one of my responses to one of the questions, is that depending on what we want to use this model for, we might just keep it as a qualitative model, or we might want to quantify it, or we might want to dynamically couple it with a physically based model. That process would continue on, I would say, every couple of months, roughly, we would be meeting up with that group of stakeholders to either update the model, maybe present some quantification that we've done. So Julien has done some work on what he terms participatory calibration and validation. And also when we meet back with the group of stakeholders, we would also begin to explore what if questions. So even if it's a qualitative model, but particularly if it's a quantified one, what if, what would happen if we increase the price of water for agriculture by X amount? What effect would that have? And something that's important to note here, the type of modeling I'm talking about today is not, the purpose is not a highly accurate, precise forecast or prediction. You would never use this approach to, I don't know, forecast a flood or something. Really, the purpose here is it's a tool for discussions and a tool to sort of see, okay, if we increase the price of water, what is the effect on whatever variable we're looking at? Is it going to be very significant, a little bit significant, or not at all. We're not, you know, we're not looking at the purpose is not a highly accurate prediction or forecast. There's just too much, too many uncertainties in the model to use it in such a way. But that's how we would keep stakeholders involved. And what we found in the majority of cases is stakeholders do want to keep involved because they're also developing their own capacities, learning a lot more about the system within which they're living and working and so on. So, you know, of course, we occasionally do have stakeholders that don't continue participating for various reasons, but in most cases, I would say most have been with the research group for quite a few years because they're learning about their system, but they're also learning, you know, about what are some potential strategies and options that are being explored that could have a very big impact on them. So they want to you know, of course, to have a say in that process. And in the past, they very rarely did have a say in that particular process.